Hello, everyone, from wherever you may be watching. This particular session is about the Cold War and the shifting global balance of power from the early Cold War until the present, the new Cold War that is ongoing. In the last session, I covered the historical antecedents to the global balance of power, beginning with how the concept originated in Europe, coming out of the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And we took that all the way down to the end of World War II. Today, what I like to do is cover, obviously, the most important segment, which is how did we get here? How did the world, which evolved from a bipolar global balance of power structure, meaning the interpretation, as it's commonly called in scholarly works, from 1945 until 1990. And then in the 1990s, a sense of euphoria that the United States was the sole power in the world determining the global balance of power, considering that the Soviet Union had disintegrated and considering that there was really no rival to the United States, either in the domain of the economy on a world scale or, of course, in the domain of defense. Those two areas, the economy and defense, are intertwined insofar as they largely determine the world balance of power. And this is what we're going to discuss today. Now, I want to start by pointing out that in the 1990s, there was a euphoria throughout the Western world that the US and its junior partners, NATO, as well as Japan, some of the Pacific countries, had won. The US had won the Cold War. In fact, there were, besides journalists, there were scholarly works promising that this is the end. There was a very important historical overview, philosophical, political, by Francis Fukuyama, entitled The End of History. He declared the end of history, although history is now repeating itself because we're in a new Cold War. There was also Samuel Huntington, who a few years before Fukuyama's work published a study called Third Wave Democracy, essentially equating democracy with capitalism, and specifically at that time when he published in the early 90s, when he published his work, with the neoliberal phase of capitalism, which was in its embryonic stage, and of course, it's in a full-blown state today on a world scale. The question that is before the world today is whether the United States is in fact in decline, as well as its trading partners. And it's not whether the shifting balance of power is moving toward East Asia, with China leading the BRICS group okay, leading the BRICS group. But to what degree is the transition going to cause chaos militarily and economically? We have been witnessing some shocks both to the economy and to world peace in the last couple of years, beginning with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, provoked to a large degree by the US-led NATO group, which insists on expansion on a world scale, NATO without borders. We're going to look at NATO today and see how NATO played a role in the global balance of power during the Cold War and how it continues to play a role beyond that into the era of the war on terror coming after 9/11. And then after that, of course, by 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea from Ukraine, the new Cold War in which we are today, and the Sino-American, the Chinese-American conflict, which is very intense, and it's not taking place just at the level of military, but technological level, the chips war, the semiconductors, but also rare earth metals. This is very, very significant for the world economy on who will have preeminence in the world economy in the 21st century. My thesis, by the way, I should tell you that this is a topic that requires an entire encyclopedia to cover. I'm just going to devote about an hour and a half to it. This is a very elaborate, very complex topic. It has so many tentacles, but this is an overview, and I'm going to focus on a specific thesis, and that is that the United States, contrary to the ebullient spirit, the euphoria, the enthusiasm that existed, especially in the 1990s, when everyone was declaring that the United States and its partners had won the Cold War, my contention is that the US actually lost the Cold War. Not that Russia won it, the Soviet Union won it, they did not. The Soviet bloc was disintegrated. It disintegrated. The old Soviet Union was no more. Russia was reduced into the Russian Federation, much smaller, much weaker economically, still, of course, has many nuclears. In fact, they have more nuclear warheads than the US. So because of the nuclear warheads, the nuclear warheads, and the fact that if they are pushed to the wall, the Kremlin has repeatedly stated that if it's a matter of our national security and survival, we're going to push the button. They're going to use nuclear weapons. So that obviously is still on the table, the issue of a possibility of a nuclear war, even on a limited scale with tactical nuclear weapons. So my contention is indeed that the US and the old Soviet Union both lost the Cold War. And the question is, who won? The answer, I think, is very obvious, that the China came out, emerged out of all this as the clear winner. And I say this not just because of the fact that China has the world's largest GDP, gross domestic product, as measured in purchasing power parity, PPP terms, 5 trillion or so more than the US, by the way, and it will surpass the US in nominal value fairly quickly, perhaps within the next 10 years. India is also catching up to the United States. India is rushing ahead to become number two, right behind China. And India is part of the BRICS group, by the way, which has a combined GDP larger than the G7. So when we look at that factor alone in the global balance of power, that is the economic situation, we see that indeed the U.S. Um, did not have any lasting benefits from the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the fact that the old Soviet republics became thoroughly integrated into the capitalist world economy, as did the Russian Federation. So not much to show for it, but China does have a lot to show for it. And this is what my thesis is today. And the question, and we're going to analyze it a little bit more, obviously, in detail. And the question is, why did the US not derive the benefits of lasting uh, enjoyment of hegemony on a world scale? In other words, the extension of Pax Americana, which starts more or less with the Spanish-American War of 1898. On the contrary, the US is experiencing decline, and along with the US, its junior partners, the G7, they too are part of that slow decline. This doesn't mean that they're going to be eclipsed by any means. I don't believe in hyperbole and extreme scenarios that somehow it's all over at the end of it. On the contrary, the US will continue to be one of the great powers, but we're going from, as we'll see today, we are going from a bipolar global balance of power. Increasingly, after 1971, when Nixon more or less modified the Bretton Woods system, as we'll see, quite a bit, to a multipolar economically, and then unipolar in the 1990s, early 2000s. And then after the Great Recession of 2008, we have the realization on the part of some very pragmatic, non-ideological people who look at the world economy. They look at projections down the road, and they see the obvious, that it will be China that will be the successor to the United States as the global hegemonic power in the 21st century. So that's for an introduction. Now, let me start with some key dates in the Cold War. First of all, the official start of the Cold War, if we have to have one, is really with the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was announced in 1947. President Harry Truman basically announced that the national security interests of the United States do not extend merely in the Western Hemisphere, that is from Canada all the way down to South America, but they are throughout the Western world. And he did this by declaring that Greece, Turkey, and Iran, these three countries, which if you look on the map, they sort of form an umbrella that that is a zone for the Middle East, protects basically the rich oil fields of the Middle East. The US would set up military bases as well as intelligence bases. The largest CIA-based base in the world outside of Atlanta, Virginia, of course, was set up in Athens, Greece. So he announced that Greece, Turkey, and Iran are Western spheres of influence, and that the United States was concerned about Soviet expansionism and communism spreading, and it was going to protect its interests, whatever they may be in the Western world, and that included, and that meant national security interests, which meant the U.S. would act covertly or overtly in military terms to protect those interests. The Truman Doctrine was a symbolic gesture that the Cold War. This is before, by the way, a full year before the Berlin crisis. This is before the airlift in Berlin. This is before that. So the U.S. took the first step, and that step was basically to delineate where the zone of influence of the U.S. would be. This marked militarily, geopolitically, the U.S. Base, where that the Western world was the base of the U.S., was the security zone of the U.S. Now, at the economic level, the U.S. had already set up a system even before the war ended in 1944 called the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system created agents, the most important so-called twin banks. Both are based in Washington, D.C., by the way. But they have branches elsewhere. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, still is a funding mechanism for monetary stabilization, that is to stabilize currencies, which during the Cold War were pegged against the dollar. The dollar was set at $35 per ounce of gold. And the U.S. Had enormous gold reserves to support all of that. And it took it up on itself to realize a balance of payments deficit to help some of its key allies in Northwest Europe and eventually in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. It did this for economic reasons so that they could be major trading partners, so that its own economy would continue to be vibrant, so that it can dominate global markets, not just of those countries that it was assisting with, whether it was loans or like the Marshall Plan, for example, in 1948, which was $16 billion in grants, basically. But also those countries had to open their markets overseas, whatever markets they had, in other words, with regard to the Europeans, throughout all of their colonies were now open to American corporations, American businesses. So this was a very important step. The World Bank was still is an institution which provides development loans for major projects, whether it will be a large water dam for producing electricity, or a steel mill, large projects, agricultural programs, large scale products. And the idea here was to stimulate trade, to provide these loans. Obviously, these loans were set at very favorable rates, by the way. Both the IMF stabilization loans for stabilizing the currencies, which tended to be weak, by the way, for um, uh, many countries, especially the global south, owing to the fact that they sustained balance of payments deficits as well as the loans that they were carrying. So there was a twin project here. One was at the economic level, the Bretton Woods system that the US would rely on to manage the world economy and as the under its aegis as the number one power in the world economically, and it was. And the other was a vast geopolitical mechanism by establishing the Organization of American States in 1948, establishing NATO in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, and then establishing the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, in 1954. So on the continent of Europe, in the Western Hemisphere, as well as in Asia, the US had these three strategic networks, very important, essentially guarding its national security interests linked to economic interests, that is, to trade throughout the Western world. All of it was justified ideologically, namely, there was an enemy. What was the enemy? The Soviet Union, originally. Then the second enemy was China. In 1949, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai prevailed against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, who retreated, by the way, to the island of Taiwan. So that year that Mao and Zhou Enlai prevailed in China and set up a communist government, the Soviet Union successfully tested the atomic bomb. This came as a devastating blow to the United States, which, by the way, the US, although the Soviets knew that the US had been testing the nuclear bomb, that had been working on it, I should say, when Robert Oppenheimer was at the head of it in the early 1940s and mid 1940s. They knew about that. When Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill were in Yalta in Crimea, in a resort in Crimea, and they signed the Yalta Agreement, Stalin knew that Roosevelt had an atomic program, that the United States had an atomic program. Roosevelt was at a disadvantage because he did not know that Russian scientists had been working on an atomic program. And sure enough, in 1949, this was a huge blow. And this is when the United States, under President Truman, began to proceed toward the hydrogen bomb, thermonuclear weapons, as we say. And it's at this point that, by the way, it starts a little bit before this. It starts within 47, but by 49, when the twin perceptible threat comes to the United States, that the global balance of power is to be upset by the fact that the Soviets have the bomb, which is leverage, by the way, as we know, if the other side has a bomb. And then China becomes communist. There is a sense of panic because the year after that, there was the Korean War in 1950. It erupted. Now, there were three major architects of the Cold War global balance of power order: Dean Acheson, George F. Kennan, and Paul Nitze. These are the three major, there were many, by the way, but these are the three major ideological and I should say political, diplomatic architects, geopolitical architects of the Cold War. And it's interesting, of those three, of course, Paul Nitze was in the odd position in the 1980s because he made a return during the Reagan period of being involved in the in the in the twilight of the Cold War. Um, in any case, these three people were very instrumental in justifying why there has to be a Cold War order. Now, the Cold War order, from an overview perspective, let me point out, was a way of managing the entire world. There are many scholars who believe that throughout the Cold War, let's say 1945, it obviously starts in 47 with the Truman Doctrine, but let's say 1945 to 1990, that period, there are scholars who argue, well, things were not so bad because the two major powers, the two global powers, remember, it was a bipolar world order, the Soviet Union on one side and the US on the other, managed their junior partners so they limited conflict on a world scale. Now, it looks that way on the surface, but when you look at how many people died in conflicts, regional conflicts, it's actually well into the millions. The estimates vary. This is the period of both the Korean and the Vietnam War. It's during the Cold War. Both Korean and Vietnam War took place during the Cold War. So this is one of the outcomes of that. The Korean War, the North was communist. It wanted to unify with the South. Obviously, that never happened. There was a stalemate. They agreed to end hostilities. There was never a formal treaty signed, but they agreed to end hostilities. And then when the French could not prevail over Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, the U.S. entered the conflict. And most people know how the Vietnam War ended. The U.S. had to retreat in the mid-70s, in 1970, gradually, but it was over in 75. And that was another sign of the Cold War not going right at all, because enormous amounts of money was spent for both of those wars, the Korean as well as Vietnam, but also, by the way, lives were lost on all sides, I should say. Now, the Cold War has certain turning points, and one of the most important that scholars mention, because the world came very close to blowing itself up, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy administration was very serious. Obviously, Nikita Khrushchev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party in the Kremlin, and Kennedy did come to an understanding. The Russians agreed not to place nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba when Fidel Castro had just taken over, And the U.S. very quietly removed some of the missiles from Turkey. And there was a realization on both sides that a nuclear war would mean mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The MAD nuclear doctrine came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early Cold War. In other words, there are no winners in a nuclear confrontation. Everyone loses, and the nuclear fallout for neighboring countries obviously is another dimension and a disastrous one. In the 1960s, the U.S. was the focus of the U.S. Cold War. It seems was on Vietnam, but it wasn't just Vietnam. The U.S. was very busy with the entire third world, which had formed many countries in the third world, the global south, as we call it today. Many global south countries had become part of the non-aligned movement. The US considered non-aligned many global non-aligned countries, for example, Egypt under Nasser, President Nasser. The US considered such countries as favoring the communist bloc, whether it was China or Russia, by the way. Not that the Chinese and the Russians had a loving relationship. There was a Chinese-Russian split because they had divergent interests, national security interests, and that became very clear as Mao Zedong distanced himself from the Kremlin. The communist world, in other words, was not a monolith the way it was presented in the West. In the global balance of power was set up in such a way as to present all communists as a monolith. That was far from the truth. The fact is, nationalism still mattered, regardless of whether a country was communist or not. That was never, of course, the primary issue in journals, but also academic books, which did not stress this issue. Certain individuals, very astute people, Henry Kissinger was one of them, understood that indeed there are differences, and he, who by the way was responsible for millions of deaths in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos during the Vietnam War, the later stage under Nixon, when he was National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger understood, however, the value of exploiting the weaknesses, the differences between communist countries, and he did exactly that with China. One reason I'm mentioning this is because Henry Kissinger's, and then of course he persuaded Richard Nixon, Nixon went along with this, approach to China to strengthen China and take advantage of its rivalry with Russia, open its market so the US corporations can make money, have rapprochement with China, right? Cordial relations. And that he figured would ipso facto automatically weaken the Soviet Union. That is the genesis of the rise of China to globalism, what Kissinger did. The Chinese, of course, Mao, and all the successors to Mao, accepted the concept of a mixed economy very gradually under a strong state structure where the Communist Party would remain the strongest entity and not allow private corporations to determine government policy. They were not going to be like the West, in other words. Yes, they were going to have a more mixed economy, allow more foreign investment, and post-Mao, of course, in the 1980s more, in the 1990s even more, and obviously we are where we are today, with China well integrated into the world capitalist economy. But the genesis of that was the Vietnam War and the Sino-Russia rivalry and the attempt of the United States to preserve its global hegemony by exploiting the rivalry amid the Vietnam War, during the Vietnam War, between these two communist countries. Obviously, eventually this would benefit China It also benefited, by the way, Western corporations that have made hundreds of billions of dollars in profits in the last 40 years, in 50 years or so. So it's not just China, but obviously China uh, did take advantage of all this. Now, in the 1970s, there was a crisis, and there were a series of crises. In the early 70s, the crisis was the Bretton Woods system itself, which Nixon, from 71 to 73, he began to modify. The dollar was overvalued. It was artificially valued. It was not worth what the fixed value was. So it went toward the fluctuating rate, which it still is today. Considering that by the early 1970s, Western European countries, as well as Japan, had risen economically in the world. The United States zenith of its power was during the Truman period. Let's just say the early Eisenhower period. The Truman period, though, the Truman presidency, was really the zenith of American power in the world at every level, economically, militarily, politically, culturally, at every level. And the reason for that is because the rest of the world emerges out of World War II completely devastated. So there's only one country, the United States, that emerges so powerful. Through the Soviet Union was a rival, especially after 1949, because it has the atomic bomb and because China simultaneously becomes communist and because the Soviet Union had Eastern Europe as strategic allies, and it had that zone of influence, which obviously is no more. The Soviet Union and its zones of influence have disintegrated after 1990, but it had all of that, and that was a source of power. So there was a bipolar global balance of power. Still, within that structure, the United States reigned supreme in the early Cold War. The structure begins to show problems in the 1970s, partly because the United States economy shows systemic problems and drags down the European economies. And one of the reasons for that is because of the United States, the balance of payments deficits were chronic. In other words, it sustained constant balance of payments or current account deficits throughout the 1950s. Eisenhower was warned in the late 50s, in his second presidential administration, by the International Monetary Fund, that the US would have a serious problem considering that it sustained balance of payments deficits on a chronic basis, because the dollar would weaken. It was artificially inflated with a fixed rate. Now, the dollar was the world's strongest currency, still going strong, but weakening, as we know, and it will continue to weaken. There are projections that the weakening will accelerate in the next couple of decades. And that's a safe projection because the US economy is no longer what it was in the late 40s, early 1950s. But the IMF warned the US privately, the president, as early as the late 50s, that the economy structurally is on the wrong path. He ignored it. When he left office, by the way, this is very important. When he left office, he made a famous speech and it was about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. Now, he did not reveal that one of the architects of the early Cold War, namely Paul Nitze, the author of National Security Document 68, NSC 68 it's called, had established, this is during the Truman period, not Eisenhower, but Eisenhower warned, without mentioning this particular document, it was a top secret document. This document basically stated that the US economy will pursue Keynesian economic policies, but not for the civilian sector, but rather for defense. This is called military Keynesianism. In other words, deficit financing to strengthen the military and have the world's most powerful defense sector. The US, to this day, has the world's most powerful defense sector. It spends more than the next 11 countries combined right now. So there's no doubt that it has that position. It's a military superpower. At that time, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, it was also an economic superpower. Today, that economic superpower status is withering away, partly because enormous amounts of money were shifted by the government from the civilian economy to feed the defense sector, exactly as it's going on today. So one of the problems was exactly that. However, the US government did not address that issue. On the contrary, by 1980, when Reagan was running for office, he ran on a campaign to strengthen the defense sector at the expense of the Keynesian economic policies, which had to do with the social safety net and social development. So he gutted many programs, social welfare programs, everything from mental hospitals to food aid and so forth. Social programs were devastated. Government began dishing out contracts to the private sector to strengthen the private sector. Defense spending skyrocketed. The goal of the Reagan administration was to force Russia to spend on defense and force Russia to spend itself into bankruptcy, which, by the way, Russia recognized it couldn't. Russia already had a very structurally very weak civilian sector. It was spending enormous amounts of money on defense. So what happened? Mikhail Gorbachev comes along in the 1980s, and he recognizes that by the way, I know a number of Russian, I have known a number of Russian people who worked in the Kremlin, and they were telling me some of them were inspectors, and they would go out to a number of factories and the collectives. And it's amazing how they falsified reports about productivity right and left. What was officially on paper and the reality of productivity were two different things. The Russian economy the Soviet economy was indeed a mess. Gorbachev injected a measure of truth to the picture of what was going on. Russia did have a strong defense sector. It couldn't compete with the West, with the US and its NATO allies. But it had a very bad civilian economy, a very weak civilian economy. Russia was a superpower and determined the global balance of power for itself, for its partners and itself, only because it had such enormous strength in the defense sector, not because it was an economic superpower like the United States. The US was both an economic and a military superpower. The Soviet Union never had that status. But Reagan comes along and spends even more. Spend. So deficits skyrocket. The public debt skyrockets to the degree that investors on Wall Street become alarmed by 1990 when George W. Bush uh, when the first Bush, the senior, George Herbert Walker Bush, I should say, not George W. Bush, the father, from 88 to 92. When he was president, it was very obvious that there were problems with excessive spending and the public debt. H. Ross Perot, a billionaire from Texas who actually ran as an independent for president, a conservative, by the way, ran on that agenda, namely runaway public debt. Well, how was that? How did that happen? The fiscal structure, namely Reagan gave back trillions to the richest 10% of Americans, and then he spent like mad on defense. So the 1980s, this was the picture in the 1980s. However, it was overlooked by not just by journalists, and I don't blame journalists because they look, they do their job. They look at the day's events. They have a shorter term horizon, but scholars were fooled by all of this as well. And those I do blame because scholars have to look at the broader picture and deeper than just superficialities. The fact is that everybody was fooled in the West. They thought, so what? The Soviet Union collapsed. By 1990, there's a new world order. The US finally won the Cold War. It will determine the world balance of power. Actually, that was a false alarm. Beneath the rhetoric, beneath the enthusiasm, when you looked at the US economy, what you have is exactly the sort of thing that winds up happening towards the end of the 1990s and 1999, 2000, namely the stock market bubble, the so-called internet bubble. Enormous speculation on Wall Street, because all along, economy operating under the neoliberal model was weakening structurally. The US was deindustrializing very rapidly. Corporations were leaving, not just for Mexico, but also Asia, especially China. So while the US was celebrating, and scholars, like I said, were applauding, oh, yes, we won the Cold War, without, again, serious examination of what exactly is it that we won. The Chinese in the 1990s very rapidly, and I mean, when you look at the history of industrialized countries, from England, which is the world's first industrialized country in the 18th century, until China today in the 21st century, you will find that China industrialized, considering, by the way, its vast size in terms of population, right? Huge country. No country has been able to undertake industrial development at that pace, technological development, scientific development, educational development. This is just a phenomenal experience that this country underwent. And at the same time, by the way, managing to reach out to the world and integrate as much of the world as possible, starting with Asia. The goal of China was initially to emulate the Japanese example, the Japanese model, but not under neoliberalism, under a strong state structure, under developmentalist policies, under one-party state, a mixed economy, which included, by the way, neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies, they welcomed, especially for the rest of the world, because it benefited them, not for themselves. They limited the role of neoliberalism within mainland China. So they benefited enormously from neoliberalism and the fact that the United States was shifting enormous resources to the defense sector at the beginning of the new century, after 9/11, with the by launching the so-called war on terror. After 9/11, the US launched the war on terror, and then it invaded two major countries in the Middle East and South Asia, namely Iraq and Afghanistan. In part, all of this was done to contain the influence of Iran, but also Russia, because in the 1980s, Russia um, had been supporting a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, and the CIA was helping the Mujahideen, these jihadist rebels, okay, whose successor are the Taliban. The Taliban eventually would take over, whom the US would, of course, invade Afghanistan to fight the Taliban, and eventually, as we know, withdraw, because there was no point continuing after 20 years. That war was going nowhere. In any case, Iraq, the same thing. In the 1980s, Iran had a conflict with Iraq. The US was on the side of Iraq, by the way. Never mind that eventually it invaded Iraq, overthrew Saddam Hussein. The US was against Iran, which has been the demon of the Middle East as far as the US and Israel are concerned, and some of the Western European countries, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The US and the West could never accept the idea that Iran could have the right of national sovereignty if they wanted. Not that the Iranian regime, by the way, is by any stretch of the imagination, is some kind of a democratic society like Norway at all. But the fact is that if they wanted to have a government that was Islamist, and for whatever reason the elite supported that type of regime, and that regime was neither necessarily pro-Soviet when it started or pro-West, it asserted a sense of independence from both, but the US quickly declared that the enemy. There was the hostage crisis. Those of you who have studied Iranian history know that. In any case, this is where we are with the U.S. Getting itself. No one created the problems for the U.S. Leading up to the shift in the global balance of power that we are in today, which is going toward China. The U.S. created those by devoting enormous resources to the defense sector, by the way. And then, after just 8 years after the stock market bubble, the so-called internet bubble of the late 1990s, we have in 2008 the Great Recession. Starts with the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2007. The US government decides to let that go. Then with the subprime mortgage corrupt practices by banks, by the way, in investment banks, including some of the biggest investment banks and mainstream banks engaged in derivatives and other products that were selling. They were selling mortgages in the secondary market. There was enormous speculation. The economy was based on speculation because the economic structure under neoliberalism in the United States, this is one of the reasons for the decline. is what economists call financialization. Financialization is when you measure an economy not by empirical data of the gross value of goods and services, but rather speculative value. In other words, the market. And what we have is enormous speculation on the market. Okay? And what country comes along in 2008 to help lift the world economy so that it mitigates the effects of the global Great Recession? China. Not because they're angels, but because they panicked that this was happening and their economy was linked to the world economy. So it was affected. They had to lay off factories, had to lay off people. So they panic. So what do? Enormous stimulus to their own economy and also to help out major economies, including the US, by the way, buying the paper, meaning the bonds, treasury bonds, so that they can strengthen and mitigate, lessen the bad impact of the Great Recession. It is right after that a number in 2009, I think there was a major book, and then a number of articles thereafter, from 2009 thereafter, a lot of books and articles were published that indeed there is a shift in the world balance of power, and the US era of hegemony is finished. Not right away. Great empires like the United States don't fall overnight, by the way. It takes a long time. It's not going to take 300 years like the Roman Empire after the death of Marcus Aurelius, all the way to the barbarian sacking of Rome. But it will take a long time. But the signs were there, and the more astute scholars began to write about it and point out that this is a transition that's taking place. The question is, of course, whose fault is it that it took place? I mentioned in the first segment of this particular topic a few days ago that there was an interesting article in Newsweek. The former CIA director, as well as former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, was one of the people who was featured. And the article in Newsweek pointed out that it hinted that the fault really isn't domestic. They didn't look at structural issues. When you look for causes of a declining empire and its status in the world system, because there's only one world system, the capitalist world system, there is no more communism. China has a communist party, but its economy is capitalist. There are billionaires in China, a lot of them, in fact. So you have basically an economy that's a capitalist economy. And there are structural causes that have to do with the economy and with the fiscal structure, the fiscal system. When you have such a small concentration of very wealthy people owning such a huge chunk of the entire wealth, that means the demand side of the equation in the economy suffers. And when you have a consumer-based economy like the United States and Europe, where consumer demands drives economic growth, but you come along and you weaken the income base of the 90%, especially the bottom 50%, and you have downward social mobility, what do you expect? The results are going to be disastrous for the economy eventually. And the other issue, of course, with the US especially, is the debt. The US has a crippling debt of close to 35 trillion, when in fact its GDP is about 8 trillion less than that, a little bit more than 8 trillion, less than the public debt. So, and even worse, projections by the International Monetary Fund is that the US GDP growth is not going to be at the levels of India and China. In fact, not next year, this year, 2024, the IMF projects that the GDP growth of the United States will be lower than the GDP growth of Russia, which is at war and facing Western-wide sanctions. And yet, its GDP growth is projected to be at least a half a percentage point above the GDP growth of the United States. So that's a structural issue, and it has nothing to do with the Chinese are undermining us. This country and that country is undermining. The U.S. has created these issues, and by the way, I should point out that some of the policies that the United States has followed, unfortunately, the sanctions against Russia backfired. No one who is level-headed and realistic and honest will argue that there has been a positive impact of those sanctions. Russia actually benefited. They circumvented the sanctions. China and India were behind Russia. Russia is actually in a very good position. Now, if China and India dump the Russians, okay, they'll have a problem. But they have a stake. China and India have a stake in Russia, which is very rich in natural resources. And it's not to the interest of China and India to weaken Russia so that the US and the Western Europeans can penetrate the Eurasian continent, that is Transcaucasus through Central Asia area, as they want to, so they can contain Iran, Russia, and China. Not to their interest. Why would they benefit from that? So this is really of their own doing. The wars in Ukraine and Israel have exposed the very serious systemic weaknesses in the U.S. role as a global power managing geopolitical and geoeconomic affairs to its own detriment, by the way. China, in my view, it remains to be seen, but China, in my view, is the beneficiary from both of these conflicts. China is the number one trading partner, has more trade with Russia, and has greater trade with the Arab countries than the West. China is increasingly becoming more popular in the Middle East, in Africa, and obviously in Asia. The US approach of using the defense sector to maintain its hegemony on a world scale and determine the balance of power is based on the assumption that only the military is the real leverage. And the military is leverage for geoeconomic advantages is somehow a magic formula, when in fact it has proved since Vietnam that it doesn't work. That's the amazing thing, that it has proved repeatedly that it hasn't worked. And we are seeing what we're seeing is the chapter of these wars is yet to be written because they're not finished. The genocide in Israel and the conventional war in Ukraine, neither is a finished war. But what we will be seeing is that the US will emerge much weaker from this. I am not optimistic about the United States coming out of the of these wars in any great benefit. I believe that the United States made some very seriously flawed assumptions, and history has proved it so far. The way the world has reacted, but it has also lost enormous credibility because the um, attempt to resolve conflict through military means obviously is not popular, not just with the rest of the world, but with the American people, considering what is going on college campuses, as well as much of society that is saying you need to find a diplomatic solution to end conflict. Um, to not to mention, by the way, the enormous costs of these adventures, these military adventures. So the global balance of power has in fact shifted. It's not that it's shifting, it's already shifted. China is the major power. I don't see the Chinese um, secretary, I guess it's the minister of finance, the U.S. secretary of the Treasury. It's in China. It's the minister of finance going to the U.S. to raise money, the way Janet Yellen goes to Beijing to raise money, to try to at least have the Chinese support the dollar, not to dump any more treasuries. It's the U.S. that goes to China. It's Americans, whether it's the Secretary of State or the Treasury Secretary, they go there. They're the ones who are asking, and of course, in the process, making demands of the Chinese, as the Secretary of State obviously did in his most recent trip, making demands that China not support Russia, which obviously is inane. It's utterly absurd. Why China can just as easily stop supporting Ukraine and come to the diplomatic table, come to the negotiating table. Let's have a diplomatic solution. And China does have, by the way, a proposal on the table. This doesn't mean that China is an ideal society. I don't want to portray that picture at all. Although it has wiped out poverty, by the way, extreme poverty, while in the U.S. poverty has increased in the last 30 years substantially, as has social inequality. So all the signs are there that there is systemic decline in the United States, and the role of the United States in the world is in fact in retreat, while in China it's on the ascendancy. And so the US is trying to slow that down. They know it's inevitable that China will be succeeding the US as the superpower, the next superpower. They know that. They're just trying to slow it down. The question is, what happens in the process, and to what degree does the US cause self-inflicting wounds? Well, I thank you for listening. We'll have a different topic next time, and you all have a great day. Thank you very much.